Welcome to MSL's Educational Forum Presents A Question of Law. This program is brought to you by the Massachusetts School of Law and is shown nationwide. The first Monday in October, October 3rd, 2005, was a day of contrasts, that is, both change and continuity at the Supreme Court. The movement towards change began last June when the court recessed for the summer. Justice Sandra Day O'Connor announced her plan to retire. But in October, she was still on the court, at least temporarily. The Chief Justice's chair, however, had a new occupant in October. After the death of William H. Rehnquist, it was now the Roberts Court, led by John G. Roberts, Jr. But there was continuity, too. Before taking the oath, Justice Roberts sat in the same chair once occupied by Chief Justice John Marshall, one of the first and most prominent Chief Justices of the Supreme Court. The new Chief Justice was, 25 years ago, a law clerk for then Associate Justice Rehnquist, who he would succeed as Chief Justice. And it was widely assumed the new chief would continue Rehnquist's conservative approach to the law. But on that recent October day, change was what was on most people's minds. The court had not had a new member in 11 years, the longest period of stability in membership since 1877. Throughout that decade, advocacy groups across the political spectrum had been gearing up for a major fight when a vacancy did occur. The very future of the court would be at stake when the membership did change, as eventually it would. After Roberts replaced Rehnquist, that future began to unfold. But the next seat to be in play was that of Justice O'Connor, a pivotal vote and voice on the Rehnquist court in many controversial issues. Many believe that Samuel Alito, a conservative justice on the Federal Court of Appeals, will gain confirmation to replace O'Connor in early 2006. What is in store for what some observers of the American scene consider the most powerful body in American government? And what does that mean for the people of the United States? We are honored to have with us today an eyewitness to that fight, to this historic new beginning for the Supreme Court, as well as to its storied past. Lyle Denniston has been covering the Supreme Court for newspapers, magazines, radio, and now online for more than 4 decades. He joins me today to explore these changing times. Welcome back, Lyle. And I am Constance Rudnick, a professor at Mass School of Law. Lyle, let's start with President Bush. He ran for office partly on a promise to nominate justices in the mode or model of Rehnquist and Scalia and Thomas. Did he do that with Chief Justice Roberts?
I think that was his intention, Connie. I think he genuinely believed that John Roberts would be as conservative, particularly as Scalia and Thomas, whom the president has always said were his favorite justices on the court. I'm not sure he totally succeeded in that. Chief Justice Roberts' career on the Court of Appeals, which was quite brief, only 2 years, shows distinct signs of a conservative philosophy, judicial philosophy. But at the same time, Justice Roberts is, I think, what he has described himself as, a more modest judge. He is the kind of judge who doesn't believe that the court should be the first line for resolution of the major social issues of the day. He is much more inclined, I think, to defer to what are called the political branches, to Congress and the executive. And I'm not sure that his underlying social outlook, his basic perspective on human affairs, is as conservative as that of Scalia and Thomas. So we expect him to be a conservative member of the court. We do expect the court to move more to the right, but I'm not sure that it will move as far to the right or as rapidly to the right as the president expected in picking Roberts.
Right. There are a number of very important cases that are already on the Supreme Court's docket. Do you expect Roberts to cast a key vote alongside Scalia and Thomas on some or all or none of these very important issues, such as abortion and terrorist trials, physician-assisted suicide, things like that?
Well, I expect that the Chief Justice will be on the same side on the bottom line of some of these issues. I wouldn't expect him to be necessarily just intimately associated with Thomas and Scalia on the actual substance of the decisions. I expect him to be a little bit more cautious, but I do expect him to be conservative. So what you can probably look forward to is a more or less close affinity in the voting patterns between the Chief Justice and Scalia and Thomas, but not in lockstep. I suspect that on war on terrorism, because we already know from his vote in the military tribunals case on the D.C. Court of Appeals that he was in favor of pretty strong executive power in that realm.
So, but he's going to have to recuse himself,
right,
at least on that case, if it gets heard, and perhaps on if a case from another circuit that raised the same issues or similar issues, he might have to recuse himself.
He has already taken a position as a lower court judge, and so ethically he is obliged not to take part in that case. But there are other cases on the way, or at least they're presently on the way, unless Congress short circuits the judicial review of what happens to the detainees. And so I would expect him to vote with Scalia and Thomas in that area. I'm not sure that he would vote with them altogether on issues like abortion, assisted suicide, physician-assisted suicide, but I do expect him to cast a conservative vote. But I think he will be identifiably different from those two.
Okay. Are there other members of the court that he might align with on other issues?
Well, my sense is that what we're going to see is a new dynamic in the court. In the Rehnquist court, it was kind of 4-1-4. It was the four more or less liberals on the left, O'Connor in the middle, usually by herself in the middle, and then the four more conservative judges on the right side of the court. With the Chief Justice's death and with the expected departure of Justice O'Connor, I kind of see a new alignment where there will be three moderate to liberal justices on the left side of the court. That would be Justices Ginsburg and Souter and Stevens. And then I think there's going to be a new dynamic center. I think the Chief Justice is going to be some of the time, perhaps much of the time, in the center. And Justice Kennedy, who is less conservative than Scalia and Thomas, is probably going to become more of a centrist on this more conservative court.
He also had at times been what we call a swing vote in some very critical issues.
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't a rigid 4-1-4. There were times when it was 3-2 and 4 and that sort of thing. And Kennedy does have very distinct non-conservative decisions in his past. For example, the decisions that he wrote on prayer at school graduation ceremonies, forbidding that, and his decision in 2 gay rights cases. So I expect that Kennedy, but remember, it's a more conservative court, so it's moving a little more towards him, and I think he will find himself more comfortable in the center. What I expect to be a bit of a surprise to most people is that Justice Breyer, who is generally considered one of the liberal members of the court, but I really do expect Stephen Breyer on a more conservative court to move a little more towards the center. He's shown some signs of that. He's a more pragmatic judge, more given to trying to get workable results than he is to achieving something that would fit some philosophical pattern. So I think he will probably be in the middle along with the Chief and Kennedy, and then Justice Alito, if he gets confirmed, as we now expect, would line up on the right with Scalia and Thomas.
Let's talk about how the court operates and whether the Roberts Court will operate different from the Rehnquist Court. You have said on a number of occasions that this was not, although these were justices who all got along very well, they did not reach their decisions by a lot of personal interaction. Right. Do you expect that to change?
I really do expect that, because when Chief Justice Rehnquist ran the court, he ran a really efficient court, by which I mean not entirely the kind of court that some of the members liked, because he cut short the kind of discussion that went on in the justices' private conference. He just ran it very, very much like a train conductor. Everything had to be on time. But I expect that Chief Justice Roberts will be somewhat more willing to see active debate go on in the conference. Justice Scalia, for example, for years has chafed at the notion that we really don't have much crosstalk in the private deliberations. So I expect that Roberts would be more comfortable with that. In public sessions, I expect that Roberts is going to look like a more agreeable Chief Justice, because there have often been times when Chief Justice Rehnquist was presiding where he was rough, where he was somewhat abrasive towards the audience, and he would cut off lawyers in the middle. We've already seen, even this early in Roberts' tenure, that he's much more gentle with the lawyers. He allows them maybe to run a little bit over in time. And so it's going to be, I think the lawyers are going to be more comfortable before the court than they have been before the Rehnquist court.
Do you think that that approach has anything to do with the fact that he practiced before the Supreme Court, that is Justice Roberts?
Oh, yes, Connie, I really genuinely believe that he is already a part of the court community. He's been there so often. He argued 39 cases before the court.
And that was while he worked for the government?
Right? Both working for the government and in private law practice.
Okay.
So he's a regular presence around the court. He knows how the place works. But he's always been a very gentle, agreeable fellow. People at the lowest level on the court staff tell me that they've had dealings with Roberts as a private lawyer. He always takes their telephone calls. He always returns their calls personally, and he treats everybody with equal dignity and respect. So I suspect and this is Roberts' way. He is a more gentle human being. He's a more accommodating human being than the Chief Justice will be. And so the fact that he's younger, he's 7 years younger than the nearest justice, Justice Thomas, but I think he's already really working into the patterns of the court and is obviously already comfortable.
Do you think that his being on the court will have any effect on Justice Scalia, who frequently uses his opinions to lambaste or demean, attack justices on the other side? Do you think that will change in any way?
I doubt it. I mean, Justice Scalia, for example, had been lectured by his close friend, Ruth Ginsburg, about let's not get so personal. She's several times undertaken to suggest that judges should not treat each other poorly as human beings, and it hasn't worked at all. And I suspect that while the court will function well, I'm not sure that you're going to change Justice Scalia's ad hominem approach to some of his colleagues when they disagree with him, because he feels very strongly about these things, and he loves to write these really aggressive opinions. And maybe Roberts can talk him out of that. I rather suspect he can't.
Okay. You mentioned Justice Thomas as being one of the most conservative justices on the court. He also probably stands alone in his willingness to overturn precedent, which is something that most judges do not lightly engage in. Is that something that you think Roberts would join in, or is he more of an adherent to the role of stare decisis, which is you follow precedent basically at all costs, except if absolutely necessary not to?
Yeah, the evidence that we have from Roberts' service on the lower court and what he said to the Senate Judiciary Committee when it was considering his nomination and his general approach, I think all of that suggests that he is not going to be regularly assailing precedent, trying to overturn them in the way that Justice Thomas regularly advocates. Justice Thomas, in many areas of constitutional law in particular, thinks that the court has been on the wrong track for a long time. And rather than trying to make little incremental changes in constitutional law, Thomas is a radical. He would like to start over in a lot of these areas. Just throw them out and start over. I can't conceive of John Roberts joining in that enterprise, even from one or two cases. I think he just will stay away from that.
Certainly the Rehnquist court actually followed that path in a number of constitutional issues. Its separation of church and state cases, for example, come to mind. There were several reversals of prior Supreme Court cases on the role of aid to parochial schools, whether by virtue of paying for computers or teachers or whatever, and that would be something that in that case, Thomas managed to get 4 others to go with him to overturn, but maybe he won't get that many in this
the
case.
Rehnquist Court did overturn some decisions. It was not a frequent occurrence. I mean, the Rehnquist Court's pattern, very much like the court under Warren Burger, who followed Earl Warren into the Chief Justiceship, would be more inclined to qualify an earlier decision rather than to throw it out and say it was wrongly decided. But the Rehnquist Court has been somewhat more willing to do that, and I think there are probably some precedents that are not going to continue to stand under the Roberts Court, but I think that they won't be eager to do that kind of thing. I think they will be reluctant to do so.
Okay. One of the cases that is on the minds of many, I'm sure, of our viewers, and certainly many individuals who've been active in the women's rights movement, is Roe versus Wade. I'm sure the president would be very pleased if Roe versus Wade was overruled, and I'm sure that he's hoping very much that his appointments will go in that direction. But it will be a reversal of long-standing constitutional precedent. Where is Roberts likely to stand on that, and what's your prediction as to whether Roe versus Wade will live out the Bush presidency?
Well, at the moment, I mean, let's assume that Samuel Alito joins the court. I still can't count to 5 on the issue of overruling Roe versus Wade. And I wouldn't at this point count Chief Justice Roberts as one of a potential 5 that would vote to overrule Roe versus Wade. He told the Senate Judiciary Committee, and again, I think we can take him at his word on this, that he actually regarded Roe as one of those special kind of precedents that have been there a long period of time, and around which people have formed their lives. They have allowed themselves to behave in ways that they expected that the legal situation on abortion rights would not change abruptly like that. And he suggested that, look, before we ever get to the question of whether to overrule Roe, we have to first examine the more recent precedent which reaffirmed Roe versus Wade. So he said, there's a barrier in front of getting at Roe. I also am not sure that the court is going to take any of the abortion cases that are coming along, like the little New Hampshire case on parental notice that they have this term, and the coming case on what's called partial birth abortion. I don't think the court would take either one of those cases and reach out and say, well, in the background of all of these cases is Roe versus Wade. Let's take another look at Roe versus Wade. I don't think that's going to happen.
So can you explain to our viewers how they can decide the case, let's say, for example, the New Hampshire case? How can they decide the New Hampshire case without revisiting the underlying issue of the legality of abortion at all?
Well, first of all, I mean, the court usually, its normal practice is that when a case is before them, they only undertake to answer the questions that have been raised by counsel in the petition to get review, and then the full written legal arguments in the briefs on the merits. No one has raised the question of overruling Roe versus Wade in the New Hampshire case, and no one has raised it, the government hasn't raised it in its new petition on the partial birth abortion issue. So it would really require the court to abandon its normal practice of confining itself to the issues raised to reach out to re-examine Roe. Now, as I said, Roe is always in the background. So if an aggressive court wanted to do it, they would have the power to do it.
Okay. We need to take a break. We hope that you will join us when we return, and we continue talking about the future of the Supreme Court under new Chief Justice Roberts.
Go to jail for a gun crime, and your family serves a sentence with you.
Passing gas in the presence of others is not only inappropriate,
That is so foul.
it can be deadly. Passing gas releases a fog of carbon monoxide
Grandpa,
and other poisonous fumes that can contribute to asthma and pneumonia.
you're killing us over here.
Kids shouldn't be exposed to secondhand smoke. Don't pass gas, take it outside.
Can I ask a few questions about the apartment on Park Street?
What was your name?
My name is Juan Hernandez.
It's been rented.
Hello, my name is Sanjay Kumar. I am calling about the apartment on Park Street.
It just rented.
My name is Tyrone Washington. I'm calling about the apartment for rent on Park Street.
It's not available.
I use a wheelchair and...
It's gone.
Hello, my name is Graham Wellington. I'm calling about the apartment for rent on Park Street. Is that still available?
Yes, it is.
Oh, it is?
Housing discrimination is illegal. If you think you've been a victim, call.
Welcome back to MSL's Educational Forum Presents a Question of Law. We're here discussing the new Roberts Court. Lyle, Justice Roberts is quite young, much younger than either one of us. Is that going to have any negative effect on his ability to lead the court, to create coalitions where they have to be made, to iron out differences and reach a result? Is his youth going to work against him, or will he be able to overcome it?
I think not, for two reasons, Connie. One, I said earlier in the program, he's already very much a part of the Supreme Court family. He's been there so often as a lawyer. They all know him well. Justice Stevens, in greeting him when he came to the court, said, "We know John very well. He's been a part of us." I think that's a factor. But the other factor, the obvious factor, he's the Chief Justice. He's first among equals. He has the power to assign the opinion writing function most of the time. He also has his hand on all of the administrative levers around the court. And the force of his personality as Chief Justice, as well as the power of the office, I think is going to enable him to be a real leader of the court from early on. Another factor is that I think John Roberts knows he's the youngest, and he knows that there are people who have been there for a very long time, and that he will respect their seniority. He will respect their contribution to the court's work. And so I expect him to be, perhaps I'm painting much too rose-colored a view of the Roberts Court's at least near-term future, but I suspect that he's going to be able to work as a leader. I think he will probably become something of a philosophical leader, working the middle, I think, of the philosophical spectrum.
And your conclusions don't just come from having sat through the hearings on his confirmation and the first month of his tenure as the chief. You watched him as a litigant, representative of litigants, as a lawyer in the court, and had an opportunity to talk to him when he was just a lawyer. Well,
and I've been, as a journalist, I've been covering John Roberts' work in the field of law for as long as he's been in it. I was aware of him when he was in the Reagan administration. I've appeared on forums with him. I know him personally. I have watched his work from up close for a long time, and my perceptions about him are based not upon what's happened in the last 6 months, but on a much longer period of time.
Okay. How about his tenure on the Federal Court of Appeals? What kind of a judge was he there? Was he a leader? Where was his judicial philosophy?
I would say that we didn't get much of a clue about that, because 2 years takes a little while to get up to steam as a judge on any court. And he tended, I think, not to use his new authority as a federal judge in a very creative or even an energetic way. He was more, I think, a follower than he was a leader in those two terms of court. That doesn't suggest that he wouldn't, if he had remained there, not become a philosophical leader or even a stronger administrative presence on that court. But I think he had too little time there. And just in the luck of the draw, he didn't get very many big and really important cases while he was there. So we didn't get much of an opportunity to test the approach that he would take. So we can't read too much into those 2 years.
We've sort of alluded to his career as an attorney, a litigator, or an appellate lawyer. Why don't you tell us what positions he actually held? You said he worked for the Reagan administration, I imagine the Department of Justice, but he was always also in private practice. Where did he work? What kind of cases did he handle? And can you glean anything about where he might go on issues from his performance in those positions?
Mm-hmm. Well, he started out after being a Rehnquist law clerk 25 years ago. He started out in the Justice Department as an advisor to the Attorney General, who was then a gentleman named William French Smith. And he was one of the young ideologues in the Justice Department, the right-wing ideologues. And even though he was very youthful, he was also very energetic in trying to advance the conservative causes of that administration, the Reagan administration. He moved over into the Solicitor General's office, which is the office occupied by the government's main lawyer before the Supreme Court. And there he argued cases on behalf of the Reagan administration. And he didn't argue them just apologetically, he argued them enthusiastically.
Because he believed in the Reagan agenda.
Yeah. So I think from those two experiences, and then then his service in the White House, in the White House counsel's office, the memoranda that have come out since his nomination to the court from all of those periods of service tell us that John Roberts is fundamentally a conservative lawyer. He has a conservative legal philosophy. They also tell us that that at least when he was younger, he was a bit pushy. He was kind of a smart aleck in some ways too. But we don't get the impression, or at least I don't get the impression, and many people whose views I admire do not have the impression that John Roberts is a hard-fisted ideologue, that he would throw over all law that wasn't agreeable to his conservative preferences. But and in his private practice, he really represented people across the board. I mean, for example, one of the episodes that came out while his nomination was pending was that he had acted as advisor to the gay rights community in a major case from Colorado a couple of years before. And so he was on all sides of all kinds of issues. And one cannot do that, Connie, really comfortably unless you are capable to detach your work as an attorney from your private personal preferences, your personal value system. So he's been able to stand apart from those conservative views and to be a very high quality lawyer.
And those are the same values or qualities that you think he would adhere to as a judge, and that is whatever his personal views are, he would dissociate them from making decisions.
Committee. My function as a judge is not to implement a private agenda, a personal agenda. I need to be guided by the rule of law. And with some lawyers or some judges, you might not take that as seriously as I do with the John Roberts, because one could tell from, if that was the only experience you had with John Roberts, you could tell that there was a strong level of sincerity there. But from what I know of him beyond that brief exposure to the public since last summer, I think it's pretty clear that John Roberts genuinely believes that his role as a judge is to be a fairly modest figure.
Is that unusual in your experience for judges high up in the federal system and particularly on the Supreme Court not to carry forth their own political agenda onto the bench?
Well, one really doesn't like to generalize, because there have been people who have believed that there was their mission in life to carry forward their philosophical agenda. Antonin Scalia is an example of that. But a lot of judges try to follow a model which many of them trace to a justice called John Marshall Harlan. John Marshall Harlan served on the Warren Court and on the Burger Court, and he was a very even-tempered, very detached kind of judge. He was quite conservative in his own political philosophy, but he set a kind of a modern standard of a judge's judge. And judges, for example, like David Souter, who's now on the Supreme Court, tries to model himself on John Marshall Harlan. I think Ruth Bader Ginsburg imagines herself to be following in the example that John Marshall Harlan set. I think Stephen Breyer is another one. So that you can tell the kind of judges who come along and become Supreme Court justices who are going to be kind of clones of John Marshall Harlan. They're going to be modest. You can tell that very early in their career. Now, some people come on and they look like they're going to be fairly modest, like Sandra Day O'Connor. But Sandra Day O'Connor became an enormously powerful member of the Supreme Court, still is a very powerful member of that court, and she was no shrinking violet. I mean, and she was not. She tried to model herself in the early years after Lewis Powell, who was kind of like a John Marshall Harlan on the court. But as she acquired more and more and more power, I think Sandra Day O'Connor was more and more willing to push her position as a powerful justice to ends that she thought were appropriate. So,
it must be very difficult, though, to separate yourself, because especially when you're dealing with constitutional issues or other social issues, because you view the Constitution or you view the statute through your own eyes, and it depends on your political, in most cases or in many cases, your political predilection as to how you interpret something. So
I don't think that they are blinded to their own pasts. I don't mean to suggest that. What I do mean to suggest is that when they come to an issue, let's take, the prototypical one is abortion. When you come to an issue where you have very strongly held personal views, that's the point at which a cautious judge just deliberately says, I am going to take my personal value system and set it aside and look at this through the lens of an objective judge, an objective legal analyst. That's when it really comes to a test for a judge as to whether or not they're going to become that detached. But by no means are they divorced entirely from their own past and their own belief systems.
We've talked about what President Bush sought with respect to Chief Justice Roberts, who was originally nominated to fill O'Connor's seat, but then the Chief Justice passed away. How about Harriet Miers? That was the president's first nominee to fill Justice O'Connor's seat. Was she nominated in order to pursue George Bush's conservative agenda in the image of Scalia and Thomas, or was there something else going on?
Well, I think there were two factors at work there. One is that this was a nomination made in some desperation. I mean, George Bush at that point was in trouble. You know, he was getting in worse trouble with the Iraq War. There was the whole Hurricane Katrina matter. The president was under siege, and George Bush has established a practice now very well known, very well established, that when he gets into trouble, he circles the wagons and he starts relying upon people who are closest to him. I think that was probably the strongest animating factor. He knew Harriet Miers. He had worked with her for years. She had been his lawyer in Texas. She had worked as a lawyer when he ran for the presidency during his campaign. He knew the quality of this person, and he was comfortable with her. I also think that he genuinely believed and there is some evidence in Harriet Meyer's personal background that she would be a conservative on the court. And as a matter of fact, he tried to give the country the assurance that if Harriet Myers went on the court, she would still believe in 20 years the same things that she believes now, which of course was a foolhardy thing to say. But I think he thought she would help turn the court to the right. I can't believe, if he knows Harriet Myers really well, I can't believe that he thought she would become a powerful member of the court, a leader of a strong conservative bloc, because Harriet Myers, in comparison at least to the Sandra O'Connor that we now know, Harriet Myers was a shrinking violet.
Okay. Obviously, we all know that she ultimately asked the president to withdraw her name. And interestingly, it was not the liberals who really upset the apple cart here and sunk the ship. It was the president's most conservative backers, or the most conservative wing of the president's own party. Did that change the dynamic in the nomination for
it certainly did. It certainly
judicial
did.
positions?
You bet it did, Connie, because first of all, I mean, the conservative part of the Republican Party and the president's strongest followers have had their eyes on the Supreme Court ever since the Robert Bork episode, when Bob Bork was defeated in 1987 for the seat that Lewis Powell vacated by retirement. They wanted a nominee identifiably familiar with and sympathetic to their ideological preferences, their philosophical preferences. And they didn't know whether Harriet Myers was of that kind. They had real doubts about her. But they also had real doubts about whether or not she was competent. Would she be able to go on to the court and become a leader, even if she were a conservative? So what happened, though, with the Republicans essentially killing that nomination, the Republicans, they really took away from the leadership, the Republican leadership and the White House, two arguments. One, the argument that every justice nominee or every federal judge nominee is entitled to an up or down vote. That's a refrain that we've heard from the beginning of the fight over Bush's judicial nominees. They took that away. They also took away from the White House the argument that judicial philosophy is not a basis for rejecting a nominee. So that has changed the whole dynamic now. And you see with Judge Alito, nobody is talking about Judge Alito's qualifications. Everybody concedes readily and eagerly that Sam Alito is perfectly qualified to sit on the Supreme Court. But it's all about philosophy now. And it's also that the Democrats, as things develop with Samuel Alito, are confident that if they prevent an up or down vote, if they are able to put on a filibuster that succeeds, the president can't complain because he wouldn't.
It was his own party
party that killed that idea that everybody gets an up or down vote. So it's a very different environment than it was last summer.
Okay. We're going to have to break pretty quickly, but let me just put this question on the table. Is Samuel Alito a turn to the right? Is this a return by President Bush to accommodate or placate the extreme right wing of the Republican Party, which has an extremely conservative, non-individual rights-oriented platform?
Yes, I mean, the short answer, and we can expand on it, is yes. That he has a 15-year record as a federal judge, and that record is replete with evidence of his conservative orientation as a judge. Now, again, I wouldn't suggest that Samuel Alito wants to inaugurate a personal agenda. He wants to carry out a personal agenda to do like Thomas would and overthrow a lot of precedent. But his orientation as a judge, the way he looks at the law, is distinctly very conservative.
Okay, we need to take a break. When we return, we hope you'll be with us, and I'd like to focus on, in addition to abortion, what some of the other areas might be that could be in for a change under the new Roberts Court with Mr. Alito or without Mr. Alito.
Okay.
So we hope you'll join us again when we return.
up, kid? We got school, yo. I see you in the window, man. You want me to do? I got the bus here, man. I got connections. We holding up traffic. Let's go. I'm not letting you waste your life like that, yeah.
Two words for you. Pop quiz. Ready? Name any funny movie. A drama. Name a mystery. And one more thing. Name the movie your kids saw today in science class.
Know what really matters. Know about your kid's school. And know about your kid. Find out 100 ways to know more, do more.
You don't have to be a hero to be a hero. When you adopt a child from foster care, just being there makes all the difference.
Don't walk. Don't walk. Walk. Do not enter. Hot dogs. Definitely like hot dogs. Motorcycle club. Everything must go. Ghostly ghouls. Don't look at that, Teddy. Body piercing. Ouch.
Everyday moments can become teaching moments because learning starts long before school does. Give your child the start they need at bornlearning.org.
Welcome back to Massachusetts School of Law Educational Forum Presents a Question of Law. We're here today with Lyle Denniston talking about the new Supreme Court under Chief Justice Roberts. Lyle, let's talk a little about some of the other areas that have already come before the court or are likely to come before the court. Areas like affirmative action, death penalty cases, federalism, the issue of federal government power versus state government power. What of those other topics, other than personal integrity like abortion, bodily integrity, are likely to undergo the most change or the least, and down to the least change under the Roberts Court?
Well, I think, for example, let's start with affirmative action. It seems pretty clear that the decision by the Supreme Court 2 years ago in the Michigan case, the college admissions case, where the court said that we're going to continue to allow schools where they make a clear demonstration that they're not only looking at race, we're going to allow them to take race into account. I think that's a rather endangered precedent right now. I think Judge Alito, for example, we know that his attitude about affirmative action is not thoroughly negative, but suggestively negative, that he doesn't think, and I think you can probably anticipate a time, maybe not in the very distant future, where affirmative action will be under even more severe challenge and may be retarded in further development. I don't think we will see an early overruling of the Michigan case, because that's, again, a pretty bold thing to do. But I think around the edges, slowly we will start to see the erosion of
Is there a case that's either been heard or is on the docket, or do you see coming up through the pipeline?
There's none that's there this term, but there are always issues like police and fire-based promotions. Those are cases coming up. Now, one of the things that may be a factor in that particular area is that one of the hallmarks of a cautious court is they don't return to an issue soon after they have decided. And so there may be an incentive in the court not to reopen that issue anytime soon. I think it would probably take a couple of years before you would get a mood within the court to revisit that issue. But I think the sentiment is going to be there, and I know that there are advocacy groups on the right that will undertake to exploit the changing membership of the court to try to find a case where you could begin to revisit that area. In the death penalty area, I think, for example, that this is a court that's going to continue to allow the use of that ultimate punishment. I think the court probably in that area is going to make it even more difficult for death row inmates to raise their issues. They're going to tighten the standards for bringing a challenge to a death sentence. We do have a death penalty case on the calendar this month, this year, this term, and it's a case involving the standards that you use when you can justify a death penalty. It would not surprise me to see some movement towards a more conservative view on that. The court is very conflicted internally about death penalty. They still think that death sentences are different, and so a whole brand of law exists only in that one area. And I think that they may try to start regularizing that a little bit more. And if there's a stronger conservative majority, I would expect that the death penalty would be more common.
Because quite surprisingly, at least for some people, the Rehnquist court ended up holding that on a number of in a number of circumstances, the death penalty it cannot be constitutionally imposed for juveniles, for people who are mentally ill, and that was basically was a reversal of earlier precedent, if not directly, then indirectly.
It was indeed,
and,
yes.
and that's probably about as far as this court's going to go in terms of protecting individuals from getting the death penalty.
Yeah, and if anybody imagined that there would come a time when there would be justices on the court like Brennan and Marshall who said we ought to throw out the death penalty altogether, I don't think that time is likely anytime soon. Another area where I think we're going to begin to see additional change, not wholesale change because the court has already moved fairly far to the right, is in the division of power between the national and state governments. I think that the John Roberts Court is going to be increasingly protective of the prerogatives of state government, and that means they're going to be less tolerant of federal legislation that intrudes on the prerogatives of the state. We've got a couple of cases this term. One's a fairly narrow bankruptcy case. Another one involves the right of disabled prison inmates to challenge prison conditions that make it difficult for them to function.
State prisons.
Inmates. And that's going to be a real early test of where this court, the Roberts Court, is on a very important state prerogative. Another area which was, of course...
Is that under the Americans with Disabilities
That's a statutory case.
Okay, and the court is already, just to sort of bring our viewers up to date, the court is already divided on how, on what part of that statute the state is going to actually have to answer to. If it's employment, they're supposed to comply, but if they don't, they can't get sued in federal court. Right. But if they're not complying with access to public buildings, then they can get. So the court has already taken the disabled and the Americans with Disabilities Act and has already protected the state to a certain extent.
Oh, yes.
So they may also with prisoners, that prisoners, even though the state is supposed to comply, if they don't, the prisoner has no recourse.
What I think may happen in this particular case, and this would be quite a conservative thing to do, they may allow prisoners to continue, disabled inmates to continue to challenge prison conditions, but only when they can make an argument that it would be unconstitutional under the cruel and unusual punishment clause, rather than access to the library, access to recreational facilities under the Americans with Disabilities statute. So I think the court might, in the interest of preserving a lot of the prerogatives for the warden and so on. Another area where I think we're going to see the court pull back is in the whole business about, and again, this is human rights or individual rights, I don't think we're going to see the court pushing the rights doctrine any further. I mean, assisted suicide is not going to be made a right. Gay marriage is not going to be made a right. So that I think the whole progress of enlarging human rights, and if I were an advocate in the gay rights community now, trying to push their particular projects and their particular agenda, I would be very fretful about this court, because I don't think that this court is going to enlarge rights in the way that even sometimes the Rehnquist court did.
Well, and the Rehnquist court, one of the not most recent, but in the recent past, was the Lawrence versus Texas, which said that no sodomy laws, which had been traditionally enforced against homosexuals, that none of those were constitutional. That was a very big move towards legitimizing homosexual conduct and giving respect to homosexuals and their lifestyle. Are they likely to overrule that? I mean, that overruled an earlier precedent. So are they likely to go back on that?
I think they might be tempted to do so. Now the question is, can you count to 5 on that? Again, it will depend upon the perceptions of people like Roberts as to whether or not people have formed their lives around that decision. But I do think that is a vulnerable decision. And it becomes a question of, and this is what we've got to watch most closely in the Roberts Court. How do they regard precedent? Do they regard it respectfully, or do they regard it lightly? And we will get some early indications of that. One other area that I wanted to mention where I think we're going to see a very distinct change, you're going to see a lot more examples of religion and its role in public life. Displays of the Ten Commandments. The court just last week denied review of a challenge to putting "In God We Trust" on the outside of a courthouse building.
I know that case. Yes,
from North Carolina.
North Carolina.
Yeah, and I think religion is going to become a much more visible phenomenon in the public square, and there's going to be an increasing intimacy between government and religion. And
well, the signs were up on that issue for the last almost 10 years.
Oh, yes.
The Rehnquist court had clearly been chipping away at what some would have called a wall between church and state.
With the one exception of school prayer, where they've remained very opposed to, at least at the high school and elementary school level. But elsewhere they have allowed. But I think we're going to see more of that. I think we've seen the last of the decision, like last term, where they struck down the
Texas
in Kentucky, where they struck down.
Oh, right. I'm sorry. Texas, they upheld
the courthouse walls display.
Right.
And I think we're going to see a lot more religion figuring in governmental activity.
How about campaign finance? That's been an area where the court has been very reluctant to put reins, excuse me, on contributions, but has restricted expenditures, or has not restricted. Has restricted. It's actually the reverse. Has restricted contributions, but has not restricted expenditures. Now, there's another case that's up there now out of Vermont. What do you think is going to happen there?
Well, I think the court is going to take a fresh look at the major precedent, which is a case from 1976 called Buckley versus Vallejo, and I think that case raises directly the question of whether or not states are going to acquire anew from the Supreme Court the authority to put ceilings on what candidates and candidate committees can spend. And so I think we may well see a change. I think they're going to go back and revisit that. There's been a lot of internal criticism within the court of that whole field of law, and I think there's a lot of tension there between the liberals that would basically like to let the government increasingly control campaign finances, and the First Amendment conservatives who think that you ought not to control campaign finance because they regard that as a form of speech.
I think we have enough time for one more question,
Okay.
and I would like to end with an issue that's clearly important, and that is the effect of Justice O'Connor's departure.
Right.
In what areas is it likely to have the most impact, assuming that Justice Alito gets confirmed and he replaces her?
Well, I think in all the areas that we've been talking about in the last couple of minutes, I think O'Connor has been a brake on letting religion come into public life, for example, because she fashioned something called the endorsement test. And it's hard for those who propose more religion in public life to pass the endorsement test. So that has been a check upon that. And she was not willing, for example, has not been willing, as Thomas has been, to virtually invite religion into the public square, generally speaking. So I think that's an area where Alito will make a difference. I think on affirmative action, O'Connor wrote the Michigan decision. I think you're going to see a difference there. I think he will probably be even at least as aggressive as she has been in trying to protect the state's rights, because remember, he is the one who wrote an opinion on the circuit court which said that Congress didn't have the power to regulate machine guns. And I don't think O'Connor would go anywhere near that far with her protection of states' power. He also, I think, is a good deal more hostile to Title VII, that is race and gender or sex discrimination in the workplace. He's written several opinions that indicate that he doesn't believe very strongly in that. And the one area where we're waiting to see how he will do it, he has criticized the whole one person, one vote concept. And no one has questioned that on the Supreme Court in years and years and years. Now, does he still believe that that was wrongly decided? That would be a very, very revolutionary move.
It certainly would. Thank you, Lyle. As always, wonderful to have you here. Thank you for joining us, and we hope you'll join us again the next time School of Law's Educational Forum presents A Question of Law.